It's been another big week of tournaments. We had 3 huge tournaments over this weekend, which we're going to be looking at. Once again, we're going to be looking at the best performing decks across those tournaments per archetype to give you a little bit of inspiration and also an idea how the meta is evolving with Archazia's Island. Once again, all of this data is coming from Inkdex, so a huge shout out to them. Such a great resource for the community, so definitely check them out. And without further ado, let's take a look at the meta breakdown. So the tournaments we're going to be looking at are Red Saber Games. That was a 128 player tournament that happened in California. The grand prize for that was an Enchanted Elsa, and there were a bunch of other prizing. So really competitive tournament. There were some great prizes. We're also going to be looking at the World Class Cards tournament that's happening in Wisconsin this weekend. 118 players. We're looking specifically at the Saturday 5K. There's also a Sunday 5K, which is happening right now. The finals of that are probably going to be later this evening, so we don't have the data yet for that. And we're also going to be looking at a tournament over in Spain. That is the Great Disney Lorcana tournament at InterOcio, which is a convention over in Madrid. 127 players, again, with a lot of fun prizes on the line there. When it comes to the meta breakdown, we've seen kind of a little bit of a flip this week. Last week, we saw really Sapphire Steel was holding its kind of dominance there as the deck with the most representation. This weekend, in the 3 tournaments we're looking at, so 24 decks total, it's actually Ruby Sapphire, which is now leapfrogged 11 Ruby Sapphire decks in those top 8 decks this week. So kind of crazy. Between Ruby Sapphire and Sapphire Steel, that represents almost 60% of these top 8 across these 3 tournaments. We do also see some other decks making an appearance, and it's notable to say that while Ruby Sapphire won one tournament, Sapphire Steel won the other. Ruby Amethyst also won one of these 3 tournaments. It was the tournament in Spain. So never say never when it comes to Ruby Amethyst. It's always going to show up no matter what the metagame is. And let's start taking a look at those decks. We're going to start with the most represented ink pairing, which was Ruby Sapphire. And the first deck here is the first place list from Christian Paleo at Red Saber Games. So when we look at this list, a few things I want to call out. Of course, it is kind of the shell that we have seen for Ruby Sapphire lists over the last few weeks. We've seen those kind of strong removal package, the combination of the Sapphire Coil along with Sisu, small Sisu and big Sisu, and of course the Maui Shark in there as well to take advantage of actions. Kind of very much more control build now. This deck list doesn't include any of the big Tamatos. It doesn't include any Lucky Dimes. It's really going all out on kind of more the control aspect of it. One thing we're seeing in this list is the reintroduction of Cusco. 4 copies of Cusco in this list, really there to help deal with locations. We've seen in some builds of Sapphire Steel, McDuck Mana can be a real headache for Ruby Sapphire to deal with, so Cusco will immediately allow you to be able to deal with that. But also great in mirror matches when your opponent is running the Lucky Dime, you can use Cusco to deal with that as well. Outside of that, only 1 copy of Be Prepared. It's in there. It's something you can recycle, of course, with Maui Shark, but really your board wipe is in the form of Sisu and the Sapphire Coil combined together. So yeah, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of people kind of building around this list, very much kind of the shell of the deck at this point, but great job from Christine there taking first place. Another list, this is kind of more pushing toward the item type build. So in this version, we do see the reintroduction of the Tamatoas. There also the Lucky Dime as well synergizes really great with him and can also be brought out for free by the smaller Tamatoa. In this list, we're only seeing 2 of the Cuscos. This player, which was Cesar, actually preferring, Madame Medusa, removal for characters instead, and also 1 copy of the Hideaway, so doing a very similar function to Cusco without it being on a body, but it does allow some more efficient turns where you can maybe play a Hideaway and a big Sisu to wipe the board of characters and locations as well. This deck list also includes Maurice's Workshop, some more card draw there for you if you didn't have enough already in this deck. And also we're seeing no copies of Be Prepared in this list. Once more, that Sisu Sapphire Coil really is just such an oppressive, fantastic one-sided board wipe, which a lot of these decks are kind of leaning on quite heavily now. Next up, we have a really fun list. This is actually from Cloud Butler. The title of this deck list is Blue Player Who Can't Pick, Must Mash, and you can definitely see the kind of the influence there of the traditional Ruby Sapphire, but also the Sapphire Steel items, primarily through Oswald. We've seen how powerful that can be in Sapphire Steel, and this player choosing to try him out in their Ruby Sapphire as well. Outside of that, the sim removal package of the Sisus and the Sapphire Coils. This is naturally because Oswald is in the list more item heavy, so we see 4 Vitalospheres, which is quite unusual in these lists, but it's something that can be found with Oswald. But also, since this play is including 4 copies of Scrooge McDuck, then it's another item that can be exerted in order to allow you to get him into play for free. And this play, because they do have those cheap items, also including 2 copies of Maurice's Workshop, works a little bit better in this list in my opinion, especially because you are potentially able to cheat it out with Oswald. But yeah, very fun to see the kind of the meshing, the combination of those 2 kind of play styles across 2 different decks in this one deck. And again, did really well. This was a top 8 deck list. And then the final Ruby Sapphire list we're going to look at is kind of more like the DKP list, and that is because it includes the Super Goofs, it includes the McDuck Manors, so relying less on the items and finding other ways to generate some lore. Outside of that, very much what we've seen in the other lists. We do have the Maui Shark, of course, being able to recur those items, being able to gain lore as well, more kind of burn lore in that sense. Also a copy of Cusco, Hideaway, again helping you deal with opponent McDuck Manors. And this list is the Ruby Sapphire list, which is including the most copies of Be Prepared at just 2. Again, you're able to get it back with Maui. It's a 7-cost uninkable. It can sometimes be a brick in your hand. So it's interesting to see just how powerful that Sisu Sapphire Coil is in that players are able to kind of cut back on that board wipe. So next up, we're going to look at Sapphire Steel. And this is the winner of the World Class Cards Saturday 5K. This is Shula Dunce's Sapphire Steel list. Shula, also known as Sky, is a very prominent Sapphire Steel player, so it's great to see him doing really well with an in combination that he's been playing for quite a while. It's quite interesting to see the modifications that Sky has made here. So we don't see the Oswalds that were making an appearance in these lists. Instead, we see Chicha. So Chicha, a really, really great way to generate some card advantage through inking. Something, of course, this deck wants to do. So those cards you're inking are often getting replaced by Chicha. We see 2 copies in here of Jim Hawkins as well, a great card to help you deal with that early aggression. If you're able to play an item and Bell on 1 and then Jim Hawkins on 2, that's really going to lock a lot of more aggressive decks out of the game. Sky has also got 2 copies of Fire the Cannons in here. Again, a way to help you deal with some of that early aggression, but later game it can also be combined. You know, Strength of a Raging Fire and Fire the Cannons can often take down a lot of big targets, even something like a big Tamatoa. Naturally, because we see so many items in this list, we do see both Tamatoas here, 4 copies of each, really giving you that consistency. Scrooge McDuck as well, so you can exert many of these low-cost items, find something like the Lucky Dime, get it out for free with Tamatoa, Happy as a Clam, and then closing the game with Tamatoa So Shiny. So very strong looking list. Of course, did really, really well to win that 5K this weekend. And Sky's opponent in that tournament was also Sapphire Steel, this time from Nicholas Montequila. And you can see here lots of similar components in these 2 decks. No Cheater in this one, so Nicholas having potentially a little bit less of that card draw ability. What's interesting in this list is we do see 3 copies of Cogsworth. That's a card that's mainly used in more Sapphire Steel aggro lists. It is a very, very good card into Steel matchups because he will shut down a lot of your opponent's removal. So definitely a great pick going into this final against Sapphire Steel. Of course, Sky did pit him to the post in the end. We do see 2 copies of Ariel here who has great synergy with the Lucky Dime, and you have so many items, it's often you're going to have more than your opponent. So again, another very strong looking list. And then the final Sapphire Steel list we're going to look at is this list from Borchas, who got top 2 at the Gran Torneo. This is the more aggro version of this list we've been seeing. So very typical. We have the 4/4 Popsicles Fortispheres, hopefully allowing you to get Bell out on turn 1 as often as possible. Very interesting that this play doesn't have any other 1-cost characters or any other characters that can be played on turn 1. A lot of these lists will use things like Mulan or even Captain Hook, but this player has opted not to do that. So they're really banking on being able to get Bell out, or at the very least just being able to get one of their items out. So that is a risky strategy, I would say, but you know, obviously worked out well enough for this player to get top 2. If there weren't that many aggressive decks in this tournament, then of course not having a character on turn 1 is not the end of the world. But after that, they do have Calhoun on turn 2. Great to deal with more aggressive decks as a way to kind of lock down the board and kind of force a stalemate. Smee for some aggression there as well. Lawrence, more aggression on turn 3. Pete to be able to lock down the board. And then this player using 3 copies of Cogsworth, as always, great in the steel matches. And 4 copies of Tamatoa, Happy as a Clam. Not all blue steel aggro lists are using the big Tamatoa at the moment, but this player is. Definitely a great card to help you with that card advantage. Being able to bring back the items to then feed them to Hiram is such a powerful engine. And then, of course, the 4 McDuck Man is such a great card going into those Ruby matchups. Cost a little bit less good when there are so many Cuscos and Hideaways flying around, but once more, this player able to do some really great things with this list. And before we go on to the next deck list, I just want to give a huge shout out to the sponsors of this video, Heavy Play. Heavy Play have their Equip Mag system, which allows you to connect your deck box to your dice box and your playmat, all with the power of magnets. It makes it super easy when you want to switch between tables when you play. They also have their curved sleeves with curved corners, which make it really easy to shuffle and mean you'll never have a card upside down in your deck again. If you want to get your hands on any Heavy Play products, you can visit them at heavyplay.com and use the discount code Inkborn10 at checkout to get 10% off your whole order. So thanks so much to Heavy Play for sponsoring this video, and let's look at the next deck list. So moving away now from Sapphire over to Amber Emerald with this Chernodog by Ghosty list. This took top 8 at the World Class Cards Saturday 5K. Very aggressive looking list here. So we have 21 cost characters. This deck really wants to be kind of spamming the board with these low cost characters early in the game, because that will then reduce the cost of Tramp. And then when you play Tramp, you're able to then draw and discard based on the number of characters you have. So it really helps you filter through your deck for the cards that you want. Oftentimes that's going to be Rapunzel on turn 4 so that you can heal up your characters. And when you've got the characters like Little John, Daisy Duck and Nala all with 4 willpower, you're often going to be able to get the 3 cards from Rapunzel. So definitely some really great synergy there. Of course, with Tramp filling your discard, you can then power up your Chernobog to get him out super early, which can be very difficult for most decks to deal with. So you can see kind of the general strategy of this deck. We've got some Go-Go Tamago in there as a kind of a little bit of extra reach late game, oftentimes with aggressive decks, especially against the grindier control decks. Having a card like Go-Go can help you gain that lore, kind of by surprise. Nice to see 4 copies of Tramp Enterprising Dog here. It can be actually a very useful card in these matchups, because if you are able to, play 3 1-drops across your first 2 turns, that means on turn 3, he can come down and he can buff up one of your 1-drops. So you'll see players use this kind of strategy to make Daisy become a 4-4, challenge into something like a Belle from Sapphire, and then in the next turn be able to then heal with Rapunzel and draw some cards off there. So lots of really fun combos with this deck. Very high rolly deck. I think if they get that kind of their perfect opening hand, it can be quite difficult for a lot of decks to deal with, especially with so many slower control decks kind of floating around. Having a more aggressive deck like this is a really, really good one to see. And of course, the 4 willpower on all of these characters make it even difficult for a steel deck to deal with too. So yeah, very, very exciting to see a new kind of archetype emerging here. And I definitely can't wait to see how this one evolves over time for us and see how it gets improved as we continue through the metagame. Another Amber deck having a really great showing this weekend. This was the 2nd place deck list from the Red Saber games. This is Adam Tetlow's Amber Steel Zoo list, and looking quite different from the Amber Steel aggro decks that we've seen. It's kind of moved past the Diggy Hole version now and kind of moved away from the dwarves, moved away from the mine train, and now it is really focusing on these high questing characters, looking to really go under those slower Sapphire decks. So we've got the Cinderella there, of course. She gives us some early game control, being able to remove some of the threats on your opponent's side of the board whilst you place your own characters out there. The interesting things about this deck, Little John, this is not a card I think I've ever seen in an Amber Steel list, but a great bodyguard with the 4 willpower there, great synergy with Rapunzel, and also can protect your lower cost characters as well. We've got 1 copy of Fix-It Felix Jr., similar stats, in fact the exact same stats as Little John, another bodyguard who can, protect your characters, great synergy with Rapunzel as well. And then 3 copies of Rapunzel's Tower, a location that buffs up your character's willpower, making them more difficult to remove, but also making them great targets for Rapunzel as well. So great job to Adam with this top 2 placement. Another Amber Steel deck list that did well. This is from Talavella, finishing top 8 in the Grand Torneo. A lot more traditional looking Amber Steel aggro list here, including the 4 copies of Mulan, great for being able to filter through your deck early game to get the cards that you need. We see 4 copies in here of Penny, a really great card that can, protect your Daisy Duck by giving her the resist, can heal up your Mr. Smee once he's got some damage on him. Always a very good line there as well. And then 4 copies of Sven, again, great for protecting your characters. also being able to allow them to sing multiple times in the same turn. So yeah, great looking list here, and great job to Talavera for doing so well with Amethyst Steel. It makes me happy every time Amethyst Steel does well at a tournament. Next up, we're going to look at the list that actually took the first place at the Gran Torneo. This is from Archazia, and it is, yes, Ruby Amethyst. Every set, and I think this set in particular, a lot of people had written off Ruby Amethyst, just thinking it couldn't really stay relevant, especially with so many items in the metagame. But of course, Archazia here has proven the doubters wrong with this great list here. So some notable things to call out here. We've got the Pegasus 3-1 evasive. We are starting to see a few more Diablos pop up in the metagame, so Pegasus there is a great counter to that, but also an evasive character that could potentially just keep questing turn after turn to generate you some lore. The Queen of Hearts is a card that's also started to pop up a lot in these Ruby Amethyst lists. A 1-4 on turn 2 that becomes a 4-4 when she has damage on her. Very, very strong, and it often means your opponent will have to swing 2 characters into her to deal with her, so that can be quite problematic. After that, the other very, very interesting card in this list is Donald Duck. This is the Donald Duck that increases the lore total requirement to 25 once he's played. In a metagame like we currently have, where your opponent can get a huge amount of lore in a single turn, Donald Duck kind of moves those goalposts, make that a little bit harder to achieve, and will potentially allow you to go under your opponent because of that. And yeah, great to see Ruby Amethyst having a really great showing as well. Next up, we have Amethyst Steel, also from the Gran Torneo tournament. This is Car V5, a top 4 placement with this deck list. Very, very similar to the deck list we saw of Amethyst Steel last week. It's got that very aggressive 1-cost package. All of these characters looking to replace themselves in some way or another in order to help you look for your answers later on. 1 copy Maleficent in there if you're able to find her. A very aggressive start for sure. And after that, after your early aggression, we have cards like the White Rose, we have the Goat, and we have the Giant Cobra. All there to get you some lore your opponent can't interact with and help you get over that finish line. It's interesting how little these decks have changed since the previous set, but it shows, you know, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Next up, we have this Amethyst Emerald discard list. The Bird's the Word by David Clayson, who took top 8 placement at Red Saber Games. So we've seen this deck start to kind of show up at these tournaments. This deck list looks very similar to what we saw last week. Diablo is still an incredibly, incredibly powerful card, especially combined with those discard cards, because it makes it very, very difficult in a lot of cases to be able to remove him from the board. Hidden Cove added into this deck list. This wasn't a card that was being included in the deck list we saw last weekend, so it's very good to see a Hidden Cove make that comeback, because we know Diablo in Hidden Cove is almost unbeatable for a lot of decks to deal with. So of course you really want to be building for that combo. After that, a lot of the typical things we've seen in these lists. Go Tamago there to help you close the game later on once your opponent has some damage on them. Prince John to really help you capitalize on your discard cards. And yeah, deck is doing well. Again, it would be very interesting to see how it responds to the meta, given that Ruby Sapphire is doing particularly well at the moment. And the last deck list we're looking at is this Emerald Steel discard list from Chronic Chaos, who took a top 8 placement at the Red Saber Games. We did see in the last meta report, Emerald Steel starting to do really well again, and this list definitely looks like the evolution of that. Of course, we've got the big Floodbomb Pete in there. Such a difficult card for a lot of decks to deal with. Remember, he does give himself resist when he's exerted, so he becomes kind of a 5/5 with resist 1. It means that he will dodge a lot of removal in the game. Interesting to see the inclusion of 4 copies of Beast Tragic Hero in this list. If you're able to aggressively discard your opponent early on in the game, then Beast is often safe later in the game, so he can start accruing you that card advantage. If you want to get your hands on Beast, he is the cheapest he's been ever, so it is definitely a good time to pick up your copies of Beast if you don't have them already and you want to build this deck list. Because of Beast in this list, because of Pete in this list, we're seeing the addition of Morph as well. 4 copies of Morph, a great shift target for Pete for Beast as well. And of course we have the Muses and Ursula, such a devastating combo for a lot of decks to be able to deal with. The Muses with their ward, making it very difficult to get them off the board, and then you can use them as a method of controlling your opponent's board by bouncing those characters back. One of the things about this list is at the end of the previous set, we'd seen kind of Emerald Steel taking a bit more of an aggressive approach with cards like Cursed Merfolk on turn 1. So these decks are going a little bit more mid-range, sacrificing some of that early game. With Sapphire Ruby doing so well at the moment, with Sapphire Steel doing so well, it'll be interesting to see if these decks kind of evolve to try and go under those decks a little bit more than this one looks like it is doing. But still, top 8 placement definitely did really, really well this weekend. So that will do us for this weekend. The Sapphire dominance continues. It's actually kind of crazy to think that 60% of these decks that took these top 8 placements were some version of Sapphire. Tamator, Bell, and Scrooge McDuck really putting in the work to make those decks super strong. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give us a like and subscribe, as this is going to be a video we're going to be doing every week and you'll be the first to know about it. A huge shout out to the sponsors of this video, Heavy Play. If you want to get your hands on any Heavy Play products, you can use the discount code Inkborn10 at checkout to get 10% off your order. Finally, a huge shout out to our YouTube members. If you're interested in becoming a YouTube member, you can hit the join button down below to get all of the details and see all of the things that are available, including early access to our videos. There are a couple up at the moment actually for members. And with all of that said, this has been another Meta Report. I hope you've found it useful, and until next time, happy questing.